What is a poem? It's almost impossible to describe what a poem is in a way that we can really have faith in. Describing what a poem is almost like describing what beauty is or time is. We know how time feels, but can we fully define it? We know how beauty feels, but can we define it? Um, what makes a poem? Well, a quick answer would be, oh, well, it's language written in meter, language that rhymes, linguistic forms that are broken into stanzas. And this would have been true really until the early part of the 20th century, more or less. But with the advent of free verse and all kinds of experimental forms of the last 100 years or so, uh, that definition doesn't really hold. A lot of poets have, over the years, tried to define what a poem is. And I thought I would share some of that with you. Percy Bysshe Shelley, early 19th century British Romantic poet, fantastic poet, most famous poem, Ode to the West Wind, probably. Ozymandias, a sonnet perhaps some of you have read, said this: Poetry lifts the veil from the hidden beauty of the world and makes familiar objects be as if they were familiar. I'm sorry. Poetry lifts the veil from the hidden beauty of the world and makes familiar objects be as if they were not familiar. So, poems make the world feel strange. Poems define the familiar world, the world that we're all accustomed to, but in such a way that that world suddenly feels strange, as if we're not accustomed to it. It's a pretty good definition of what poetry does. Of course, other art forms can do this as well. Painting, certainly. You go see a painting, see, say, Van Gogh's Starry Night. We've all seen Starry Nights, but then you look at that painting and then you see Starry Nights after looking at that painting and they don't feel the same anymore. There's a whole school of thought, early 20th century, the Russian formalists, who claimed that the difference between literary language and non-literary language is this: literary language defamiliarizes the familiar, whereas non-literary language is just trying to describe the familiar world. So that's Shelley. Poems lift the veil of familiarity of the world and make the familiar world feel strange. I like Emily Dickinson's definition too. She says, if I read a book and it makes my whole body so cold no fire can ever warm me, I know that is poetry. If I feel physically as if the top of my head were taken off, I know that is poetry. If I read a book and it makes my whole body so cold no fire can warm it, if I read a book and I feel like the top of my head has been knocked off, that's a poem. So, visceral, violent definition of poetry here from Emily Dickinson, that when we read a powerful poem, it affects us on a purely bodily level. Physiologically, we are charged or pained in ways that we normally would not be. I think Dickinson probably experienced the world that way. Her poems have a kind of verbal aggressiveness that certainly make me feel like the top of my head's been blown off sometimes. It's funny. I've taught Dickinson for years, and I've shared this definition of hers of what a poem is for years. And when I was younger in class one time, I tried to sort of act out what it would be like. So I said, if you're listening to Dickinson's poem, there's a certain slant of light, winter afternoons, that oppresses like the heft of cathedral tunes. And I said, that feels like, and I hit myself in the head to like the top of my head's being blown off, and I think I gave myself a minor concussion that day. I felt a little woozy and nauseated for the rest of the day, but I don't do that so much anymore. That's Dickinson. Robert Frost. Poetry is what gets lost in translation. So if you think about that, if you're translating one language to another language, you can do that with a grammar and a dictionary, but there's always something lost. So the poem is trying to capture that mysteriousness or that essence that gets lost in translation. William Wordsworth says that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling. That when we feel especially moved and we're overwrought with emotion, we need poetry to express that. Wordsworth added that its poetry is also emotion recollected in tranquility, meaning that we have the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling. Probably shouldn't write a poem just then, because we're too overwrought with feeling. Poem's probably going to be pretty bad. So let's just wait a while and recollect that emotion in tranquility, and then we can actually have a poem. Hold 1 second. I have a lot of light shining on my face. I need to lower my blind. Oh, that's much better. Okay. Randall Jarrell, 20th century poet, and this is the last definition I'll share, had a really interesting definition of poetry. Not so much what a poem is as how a poem originates. He says this: a good poet is someone who manages, in a lifetime of standing out in thunderstorms, to be struck by lightning 5 or 6 times, a dozen or 2 dozen times, and he is great. So poets, as it were, are brave enough to stand in the thunderstorms of life, the scariest, the most challenging moments of life, and try to understand. You can stand out in that weather, that emotional weather, your whole life. And if you're a good poet, you get struck by lightning, meaning you feel the inspiration, the light, the luminousness that allows you to describe your feeling. A good poet might get struck, what does he say? It's 5 or 6 times. A great poet, well, 2 dozen times. And if you look at any poet's canon, this kind of feels right. I mean, great poets, I think say Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman wrote a lot of poetry over his lifetime. And I would say of all the poems he wrote, a dozen are the ones that I keep going back to. I'm not saying that's what makes them great, but those are the ones I keep going back to over and over again. So what I want to do now in the rest of this talk is be more specific about what a poem is. And my hope is that in trying to describe what a poem is, mainly in contradistinction to prose, this will be a starting point for us as we move into our investigation of poetry. So the most obvious difference between poetry and prose is this: poems rely on sound for meaning. Poems, like prose, rely on semantics for meaning. The meanings of words you can find in a dictionary. Poems, like prose, rely on syntax for meaning, word order. But poems, unlike prose, rely on sound effects, meter, rhyme. William Butler Yeats's poem, The Lake Isle of Innisfree, published in 1890, is a kind of extreme example of how a poet uses sound effects to convey his meaning. I'm not going to recite the whole poem, just the first stanza. I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows will I have there, and a hive for the honey bee, and live alone in the bee-loud glade. So the poem's about Innisfree, this beautiful island in the natural world that the poet longs for while living on the gray pavements of a city. So it's a poem about yearning for an ideal place, a place that ultimately we discover is in his deep heart's core. There really isn't Innisfree. It's an island in Ireland where Yeats grew up. So here we can imagine him in the London cityscape, yearning for this place of childhood harmony and beauty. And the language itself is highly artificial, meaning that it has a lot of literary effects, lots of assonance or repetition of vowel sounds, lots of O's and I's. I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree. We have lots of alliteration. 9 bean rows will I have there, and a hive for the honey bee. We have that as well. And of course we have rhyme, free rhyming with bee, and made rhyming with glade. The poem feels almost like a Gregorian chant. We actually have Yeats on tape reading it in a rich Irish accent, and he really does sound it out as if it is a kind of Gregorian chant. I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows will I have there, and a hive for the honey bee, and live alone in the bee loud glade. Yeats is much better. You can find it online. So we can easily say what this poem means in terms of semantics. We can say, oh, well, okay, this I'm going to get up and I'm going to go to Innisfree and I'm going to build a cabin there. I'm going to make it out of clay and wattles, and I'm going to have some bean rows, and I'm going to have a honeybee hive, and I'll be alone there and I'll listen to the bees buzz. That's a prose translation of that verse. It's a prose paraphrase of that verse. Well, but that loses so much, doesn't it? It loses that intensity, that musicality, that chant-like quality that makes us think of Innisfree as a sacred place, a holy place, about which one might sing a kind of hymn. Not only do we experience this with the rhyme and the meter, the assonance and the alliteration, but also with the syntax. And a small cabin build there. Normally we would say, I will build a small cabin there. But this inversion, and we see it also with 9 bean rows will I have there. Normally we would say, I will have 9 bean rows there. This inversion makes us slow down. It sort of derails our syntactical expectations and makes us pay attention to the language in a way that we would not pay attention to the language if we were simply reading prose. So there's a heightened quality to the language, an intensity to the language, a musicality to the language, all of which would not be present necessarily in a prose paraphrase of this poem or a prose description of Innisfree. So that's the primary difference between poetry and prose that really holds even for free verse. You'll see rather quickly that even though free verse doesn't use set rhyme pattern or set metrical pattern or set stanza pattern, the sound effects and the musicality are essential for what the poem is trying to convey. So I'll say this, a poem is what it is about. This poem is about a place called Innisfree that exists in the poet's heart. It's not necessarily a literal place for him. It is, but it's more how it feels to him in this urban landscape. So that's what the poem's about. And the language, it's so heightened and intricate and harmonious that it is a kind of verbal rendering of what Innisfree feels like to this poet. What I'm saying is there's a kind of idealized quality to the language. It is so musical and so harmonious and so intricate that it feels like this wonderful pattern, building, cabin, if you will, made of words that has that kind of harmonious feel to us as readers that Innisfree itself has to the poet. So we have that distinction. Sound conveys meaning essentially in poems in ways that maybe not so much in prose. Because of this, another definition that many people see between poetry and prose, erroneously I would say, many people say, well, poems are difficult and prose isn't necessarily difficult. Prose is expository if it's nonfiction. It's there to make clear, there to explain. The words are like windows between the reader and the writer's mind. But in poems, it's like the words are crystals or prisms or stained glass, that there are distortions and reflections and refractions between the writer's intention and our experience of the words. Well, one reason poetry feels difficult, of course, is because sound is such an essential bearer of meaning, and often poets will use words in strange ways to us to convey certain sound effects. But I think it's more than that. I think that there's a way in which poems, great poems, are about experiences that we all have, but they're so complicated and nuanced and mysterious that to capture them accurately, the poem must use words themselves that are nuanced and mysterious. I would argue that the great poems are as clear as they can possibly be. That the most powerful poems are the poet's effort to use the most appropriate language possible for describing human states that are almost indescribable. I mean, can you really describe what it feels like to fall in love? Can you really describe what it feels like to be terrified? Can you really describe what it feels like to be traumatized? Yes, we try to do this all the time, but to get at the essence of those states, states that really evade full description, the poet sets a very difficult task and often must create verbal patterns that feel dense, condensed, intensified, difficult, but because trying to describe very difficult states. So, sound, a tendency toward highly condensed verbal structures, we can say difficulty. Three, because poems are trying to say a lot with a little, they tend to be more figurative than prose. You tend to see more figures of speech, metaphor, metonymy, synecdoche, simile, for instance, in poems, because these figures of speech are ways of concretizing feelings and thoughts, ways of trying to put a lot of rather abstract energy into small, concretized verbal forms. So that's another reason we probably tend to think that poetic language is difficult, because of the highly figurative quality. But again, I would say that the poets are using that figurative language to try to condense into the most concrete image possible difficult thoughts and feelings. So I'll stop there. I think those are three ways that we can begin thinking about what a poem is in contrastinction to prose. I'll say once more that everything I've said does not hold once and for all. There are prose poems. There are lyric essays. There are many exceptions to what I've been talking about. There are novels, Joyce's Ulysses, Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, which read like poetry. Melville's Moby Dick has passages that reads like something straight out of Shakespeare's tragedies. So everything I've said about poetry here can sometimes appear in literary prose. Absolutely. So I'm talking about general tendencies. In general, we can say that poems are verbal structures that rely on sound as part of the way they convey meaning, that tend to be linguistically intense or condensed to the point where they feel difficult to read, and tend to be more figurative than the language of prose.